Most of us avoid having hard conversations for as long as we possibly can. But when you are called to be a prophet of God in the court of a king, hard conversations are actually at the top of your job description. And they can also regularly place you in mortal danger. I can imagine Nathan, the prophet, lying awake at night looking for a strategy for this extremely hard conversation he needed to have, this extremely dangerous conversation. And we know that he was a genuine prophet of God because he settled on the one plan that just might work. He told a story. There were two men, one rich, one poor. The rich man had everything he could possibly need and more, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb. He raised that lamb in his home. It grew up with his children. He would feed her from his own inadequate bowl and let her drink from his cup. She was like a daughter to him. An unexpected visitor came to the rich man's house, and he refused to take anything from his own well-stocked pantry, but instead he took that poor man's lamb and prepared her for the guest who'd come to him. Pretty powerful story. And Nathan uses this story to draw David to condemn himself. In the Gospels, we see Jesus doing that all the time, don't we? Using stories to get in people's heads. His hearers absorb the story and identify with one or other of the characters. Perhaps it's the Good Samaritan story. And we might see ourselves as, say, the one who's beaten up and left bleeding on the side of the road. Perhaps that's who we've been most often. Or we might see ourselves as the Pharisee who passes by and pretends not to notice. Or maybe we are the outsider, the enemy, the Samaritan who crosses all the boundaries to show crazy, reckless love by binding the stranger's wounds and paying for his care. As we identify with one character, we are challenged to notice those parts of ourselves that are more like that other character that we don't want to be. Stories have power to get into our heads and our hearts and to begin a deep work of transformation. Last Tuesday was the day in the church calendar when we remember the life of William Wilberforce and others who worked in political systems to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. These people worked relentlessly in political and legal systems and ought to be honoured for that. But real transformation happens at the level of thought and feeling, head and heart, as well as law and policy. 50 years after the slave trade was officially abolished in Britain, on the other side of the Atlantic, slavery was still a very brutal reality in the southern states of America, though it had been stopped in the north. The Fugitive Slave Act made it illegal to give refuge or assistance in the northern states to people who had escaped slavery in the south. There was a gifted writer from a community of Christian activists and academics who opposed this act. One of her friends urged her, "If I had your gift, I would pick up my pen and do something about this." Well, she did pick up her pen. And what she wrote was not a political speech or a theological treatise about slavery, though I suspect she was more than capable of doing both those things. Instead, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a work of fiction which has done more to change minds and hearts about slavery than all the world's political speeches and theological treatises put together. Stories are not just stories. They have power to get inside us, to transform us as we identify with the characters and begin to see the world from a different perspective. The story Nathan told worked in David until he came to a point of condemning himself. The man who has done this deserves to die, he said. And then all Nathan had to do was say, well, you are that man. This story had real power. It also showed David that sin is not about breaking rules. It is about breaking relationship, about hurting people. And isn't that something that Jesus emphasized all the time? When Jesus was asked about the greatest commandment, he replied, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Obeying God is not about having a to-do list and a to-not-do list. It is all about love. Loving God, loving people. If Nathan had presented David with a list of transgressions, he might have justified each action point by point, or he might have apologized profusely and promised never ever to do any of those things ever again. Either way, the focus would have been on his actions and not his heart. And his heart was the problem. His heart was what needed to change, not just his behavior. A list of transgressions was not going to touch his heart, but a story, a really good story, just might. So let's take a closer look at this story. A poor man loves a little ewe lamb and treats her like a favorite daughter. She drinks from his cup and sleeps in his arms. I can imagine him dressing her in a tutu and ballet slippers and dancing her around the house and trying to teach her tricks. It's a little bit crazy, isn't it? But that's part of the charm of this story. Love can be a little bit crazy. It is so focused on the welfare and happiness of the other that it doesn't care about looking dignified. This poor man really loves his little lamb. And then there's the rich man. He had a visitor and he was too stingy to feed that visitor from his own extensive supplies. There is no love in this man's heart, no generosity at his table, no hospitality in his home. This man had a lot of stuff, but where it really mattered, he was utterly destitute. And out of the deadness and coldness of his heart, he does the unthinkable. He takes that treasured little lamb from the poor man and kills her and serves her to his guest. So we have two people here. One who is deeply alive with loving relationship and he's happy even though he is poor. And the other is strong and secure in his wealth but is completely dead inside. Two characters, two ways to live. And life can sometimes toss us between those two options, can't it? Our hearts call us to live or to love recklessly without counting the cost, but this world can be a cold and hard place sometimes. And people who follow their hearts can get crushed, just as this poor man was. Harsh experience can drive us to the opposite extreme, to become like the rich man, to strangle our hearts until we care nothing. We care about nothing but holding on to what we already have. This is the choice between life and death. And it's not always an easy choice. And sometimes it's a really scary choice. We can follow the path of crazy, reckless love and risk getting stomped on, or we can let fear strangle our hearts so that we become the sort of people who stomp on others. And I know most of us find a place to live most of our lives somewhere between those options, but every now and then something happens that calls us to make a choice. And when we make a choice, which of those characters are we going to be like? This story isn't just about David, it's about all of us, about the struggle to be fully human, fully alive and loving in a world that does not feel safe. Nathan used this story to hold a mirror to David, to show him that he had become cold and dead inside. And still 3,000 years later, this story holds a mirror to us, and it asks us, are you the rich man or are you the poor man? Which would you be if you had a choice? David was the rich man. And there was no simple way out of that. If your heart is dead, what you need is a new heart. And that can be painful. That's why the psalmist pleads, create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. The deep surgery that happens when we ask God to remove our heart of stone and give us a new heart, well, it can be painful and we can be left with scars. But there is beautiful new life on the other side. But not all of us identify with the rich man. Some of us are the poor man, the victims of injustice and exploitation. People who have been fully alive with crazy, reckless love and have had that beloved thing torn from them. What does this story say to the victims of this world? Well, for a start, it tells us that God is on the side of the victim, that God delights in crazy, reckless love, and God sees the injustice, and God will do something about it. In fact, if we look at the story in the light of the whole Bible story, we see that God is not just on the side of the poor man in this story. God is the poor man. The ewe lamb represents Israel, and through Israel, all of humanity. God chose us and brought us right into God's heart, God's house, God's table. God cherishes us with love that is crazy and reckless, beyond the craziest of human love. Ultimately, God does the craziest and most reckless thing by becoming one with us and dying for us, with us, by becoming the little lamb that is sacrificed. Crazy, reckless. That's the sort of love we need. This is the story I want to listen to. Stories can be life-giving or they can be soul-destroying. We need to be careful what stories we are listening to and living by. We need to be careful what stories we are telling to ourselves and to others. And so I ask you, what stories have you been telling lately about yourself, about each other, about your church? Is your story life-giving or is it soul-destroying? Do you maybe need to find a new story? Our world at the moment, it seems to me, is being torn apart by competing narratives, by different stories people are telling themselves about the state of the world. One story is about how the world is moving rapidly towards the political left. In this story, we need a hero to fight for us so we won't end up with another Stalin or Mao Zedong. The other story is about how the world is moving rapidly toward the political right. In this story, there are no heroes that can stop the progression towards another Hitler or another Putin. We could talk about which story is more accurate, but I would rather notice that what these stories are doing to people in our world. One tends to lead to violence and the other to despair. And both to a diminishing ability to listen to and love people who live by another story? What if we were to tell each other an altogether different story? One that gives hope, one that motivates us towards kindness and compassion, one about the crazy, reckless love of God who becomes tiny and vulnerable, holding hands with our vulnerability and carrying little baby lambs like us through death into resurrection life. Amen.